Minutes past 8 now.
Question number 3, Grant Robertson. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by his statement that his hour-long show on Radio Live on 30 September 2011 was an, quote, election-free zone?
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Prime Minister, yes.
We're, of course, looking at DJ John Key in this session of State of It with Selwyn Manning from livenews.co.nz. Morning, Selwyn.
Yeah, good morning, Glenn.
Yeah, so the issue that came up before the election is now a big issue as we launch into 2012.
Yeah, it certainly is. And it's kind of like on the back of that hellish week last week where the National Party's close friend, the Māori Party, threatened to walk out on executive government. We get this week, with John Key, the Prime Minister, and his appearance as DJ John, as you referred to him as, on Radio Live in the election period last year, deemed possibly and allegedly illegal under New Zealand's electoral laws. Now, some people, Glenn, I think might find that this whole issue is rather trivial, but I disagree. When the Prime Minister and his media team decided to accept an invitation to appear on Radio Live on September 30th, they clearly knew it was pushing the perimeters of electoral law. If we've got it there, let's just take a look at the 3 News report by Kim Cho there.
John Key is no stranger to radio, but this was the first time he had been the one calling the shots during the Prime Minister's hour on the 30th of September, less than 2 months before the general election.
Believe it or not, as a politician, this is an election-free zone this afternoon. So if you want to ring and ask me about whether we have a cat or what my favourite food is, feel free. But if you want to know about tax policy, come back another day.
But that wasn't enough to keep Radio Live out of trouble. The Electoral Commission has decided the show was an election program, something prohibited under the Broadcasting Act.
So was it an election-free zone, Selwyn?
Well, my thing is here, I guess my push here, in my opinion, is resting on this. The evidence, in my view, is that there was a preemptive position that the Prime Minister took. That is to say that, he himself kind of pushed this zero politics zone as some sort of defence should things go awry. The label, in my view, Glenn, was an indication that he and his team were well aware that they were about to embark on shaky, if not dodgy, kind of legal ground. And the Prime Minister appears to believe he did not breach the electoral law, but with respect, it's not really for the Prime Minister to judge that. And surely, a Prime Minister, it must be seen to operate within the law, and obviously, but also to embrace the spirit of the law. And I think that's what this comes down to in many areas, irrespective of whether or not he agrees with the law's premise. By simple definition, John Key's title, he's a Prime Minister. It's the most powerful politician in the land. His whole being, in the sense, is political. The public's regard for his competency is connected to his political ability. His vision of New Zealand is political, and the means of establishing that vision is political as well. And all of this is in relation to his connection to the people of New Zealand as a politician. So it's very, very, very much a long bow to draw for John Key to suddenly, on the cusp of an election campaign, to claim that when he is appearing for an hour's DJ slot on a very prominent radio station, that he is not going to be representing politics.
So do you think it's fair to say, though, that the whole 3-year term, that he is in fact an election mode as such?
No, if we look at, that's where strategies come in. I think, the election mode the strategies employed during an election year are specifically different to now. And I think that what we can take from that is it's a sensitive election year, clearly, that any kind of dent in the armour of a party or a politician, especially the leaders, is seen as immediately potentially damaging. Likewise, any possible lever that they can get in a possible sense, even if it's minute, is important to their brand. Things can go awry very quickly, as we saw with Don Brash in the 2005 election. where he was seen to have been, well, some say caught out and not being forthright with the truth relating to whether or not he had dealings with the brethren. That became a big issue very quickly, and you can see in election years parties and politicians, especially the leaders, are very careful not to go and dent that armour and affect the trajectory they're on, unless they wanted to go up, of course. In a time like now, the strategies are quite different. I think in the National Party, in the caucus, and in the cabinet, certainly those that are jockeying around on these types of things, they're looking at medium and long-term gains here. So in some ways, the National Party will be looking at these irritations like what we're talking about today, and we made reference to the Māori Party last week, in a sense of the medium and long-term kind of effect it may have. If this kind of continues on, well then, I think we can rightfully kind of label this period as a late summer of discontent for National. It may recover. His populist position is obviously very, very, very solid. But whether or not that holds on when these types of things come out, particularly when it questions his choice, his decisions, his credibility of, the credibility underlying those decisions, then people may start to actually think, well, is this populist Prime Minister actually worth his salt?
Well, I guess you could argue that some of this started with the Rena grounding and then the teapot tape, so it did start perhaps even just a little bit before the election, and this is sort of a continuation of it. But just getting back to this this irritation, as you call it, of course, it wasn't the complaint wasn't laid against John Key; it was laid against Radio Live.
Yeah, well, that's right. And this is the strange thing in a sense that it's all about the election here, obviously, and the electoral law period, and the Electoral Commission has deemed it to be this interview, this DJ gig, to have occurred during that period. That's established kind of fact around the matter. With Radio Live's part, well, it's been found to have, and there's obviously a lot of legal kind of things that are going to churn through here. You've got to remember that there's an investigation in the hands of the police over this now. So we obviously got to wait for the outcomes of those to really get a good grip on what the true consequences are. But the allegations are that Radio Live, breached the electoral laws in allowing the Prime Minister to have his hour slot. My feeling on this is that, surely the Prime Minister comes into the frame here. Even in question time yesterday, the Prime Minister was not in attendance at question time in Parliament yesterday. So Jerry Brownlee was answering these questions on his behalf. And he kind of made reference right at the end of a series of questions from Grant Robertson, the Labour Deputy Leader. And he says, well, it's in the hands of the police and they're investigating Radio Live. And, he kind of flipped it off. There was a certain element of flippancy in a sense too, and one of the questions that really concerned me, or stood out to me, I suppose, was Jerry Brownlee when he said that the Prime Minister had no obligations under the electoral law,
right.
And I kind of really left wondering, and I'm sure many people scratched their heads and thought, what does that mean? Is Jerry Brown? Yeah, what's it mean? Does it mean that the Prime Minister has no obligation under the electoral law to front up to Parliament? Well, it would suggest that if the police actually thought that they do have to interview him when they go knocking on his door, he'd have an obligation to front up there. And surely, as a Prime Minister, the head politician in the country, the most powerful position, surely he should have an obligation to be working within the spirit of the law. Now, this, in my view, isn't all about testing whether or not that interview on Radio Live affected in any way the outcome of the election. That's not what it's about. It's about whether or not that interview came in breach of the law there, that whether or not the interview possibly could have affected. And the test isn't whether or not it did, it's whether or not they were in that space and possibly in breach. And
right.
It'll be interesting to see where this goes to. And I kind of think too that and just looking at it and just in summarising these things, that the National Party strategists, like we were saying before, they certainly need to kind of consider whether or not this populist element of the Prime Minister can sometimes be like a it's problematic.
Yeah.
Has it been out of control in times where there's high pressure, like during the election campaign? Has that populist kind of position that he has taken potentially going to lead the National Party into some sort of contempt, whether it be contempt from the Prime Minister for laws that are supposedly there to protect a fair level playing field in campaigns, or whether or not it's contempt from the public that toward this once popular Prime Minister. I wonder whether down the track that's going to occur. But I would imagine that they'll be looking at this and they'll be thinking, gee, we need to contain this persona to a degree. He's obviously a solid and sound, credible Prime Minister, but there's stuff like this that, I don't know, Glenn, it's very concerning. And if we look back, I guess, in the Helen Clark term, there was a lot of hoopla and a lot of attention given to whether or not the Prime Minister, Helen Clark, at that time had signed a painting that was being auctioned.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, that was a point of ethics. This is a point of law, and I think it's a little bit precious of the National Party that called the police in on media who taped the Tea Party discussions, or there was a tape that eventuated from the Tea Party discussions at an event that they were invited to, for the same party, the same Prime Minister, to then hide behind some sort of convention of flippancy where this doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot more to that.
And just before we finish, if I can add to that I think early on the Prime Minister and his campaign and strategy team found a baseline of opinion that exists in New Zealand and have written everything and have conducted everything according to that baseline opinion and what that baseline of people will think about certain things. There's certain people that will say, great, love that show on Radio Live that John Key did. I don't agree with the media taping that conversation. There's a baseline of opinion that is with him, but as you say, it'll be interesting to see whether any of that starts turning back on them. But that is State of It. Selwyn Manning, thanks very much.
Okay. All the best, Glenn.
See this video once more up